Welcome to the Headley Mahy podcast. I'm Nick Headley and I'm sitting today in the offices of National Grid to record the latest edition of our podcast, and the topic today is on diversity and inclusion. And who better than to join me for this discussion than two of the UK's leading general counsel, Helen Mahy of National Grid and Rosemary Martin, who literally, as of yesterday, has been announced as the new general counsel and company secretary of Vodafone. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining me. Let me just start with a few statistics. You are two of 11 female FTSE 100 general counsel. If you look in the CFO function, there are just 3 FTSE 100 CFOs and only 4 FTSE CEOs. And then when you look at the composition of FTSE 100 board of directors, it's just 12.2%. Not great statistics, but perhaps turning to you, Helen, first. To win hearts and minds on this issue, it's a lot more than about quoting statistics, isn't it?
Yes. When I took over responsibility for inclusion and diversity here, one of the key things was getting a coherent business case as to why this mattered. And essentially, we realised that we weren't going to achieve our business aims, our group strategy, unless we had the best people, unless we retained the best people. We didn't think we were actually doing as well as we could do. And that we wanted to have more women, we wanted to have more ethnic minorities. And we also felt we wouldn't be recognised externally as being the foremost utility unless we had the right inclusive and diverse culture and statistics. I mean, statistics are just one way to show that how you're doing. We also felt that we had probably concentrated too much on the diversity angle and the statistics and not enough on the inclusion, because 75% of our workforce are male. So we produced an inclusion charter, which basically is for everybody here and sets out what the work environment should be. So what people expect to be and how they expect to be treated and what they will do about it. And that actually applies to everybody, from the CEO to the janitor. And unless you get it right at all levels, you're not going to move forward.
And Rosemary, you occupied a similar role at Reuters. What was your experience?
My experience was similar to Helen's. We also felt that we needed to articulate a clear and crisp business case, and one that was relevant to the rest of the business strategy, and I think that linkage is essential. For Reuters, it's a very international company, and in order to be able to represent our customer base, the wider customer base, which is basically everybody everywhere, we felt it was essential to ensure that we were bringing into our own company people from diverse backgrounds. And when we looked at our own statistics, we had good diversity statistics across the lower levels of the organisation. When you start looking up, the statistics looked much less convincing. So there was a real issue there, not only around recruitment, but also about retention. And as Helen has said, we felt at Reuters that a key to being an effective organisation was being able to be innovative and nimble and creating a work environment that people wanted to be in. And to achieve those things, you need, I believe, to have a diverse workforce and one that respects everything that people can bring to the table. To get that change is really difficult. And I must admit, before I really started working on diversity, I hadn't appreciated how complex it is, both within organisations, how difficult it is to engender change.
Practically, how do you then do that? How do you actually get people to embrace it, to live it, and make a difference?
Well, for us here, I think it was focusing on the inclusion. We realised that there was a lot of misunderstanding about what it all meant here. And that the statistics are important, but it was much more the culture of the place. And so we used an outside firm which does sort of drama for training, which we ran out at the top level. And it was really on how you behave. I can remember after when we rolled out the training for all the directors, all the senior managers, in fact all the board have been on it, non-execs as well, they've all done it. We're now rolling it out through middle management. But after the initial rollout, I had a senior manager who I know quite well, who I'd always thought was a really good guy, really good sort of, live the values, etc. And he came into my office, he said, I've just done the I&D training. He said, it was amazing. I've never thought about I&D before, I realised. He said, I'm having meetings, at my staff meeting I have at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. And he says, but half the people that work for me, they don't normally come in till 9 because they drop off their kids. And I never thought about having the meeting at 8 o'clock because it suited me and didn't suit them, and how difficult it must be. I'm going to change when I have my management meeting. And I thought, great, somebody's got it. Small things like that,
Yeah.
just acting in an inclusive way, can change an organisation.
And is it about incremental change, this? Is it slowly winning hearts and minds and, almost one by one there's a sort of trickle effect through the organisation, or is there more of an alleluia moment?
I think it's both. I think you need alleluia moments with very influential people, because in my experience there are sort of node points in organisations. There are people that haven't necessarily got senior positions, but they are very influential. They can be powerful because quite often they're very charismatic. At Reuters we took a similar approach to what Helen's described at National Grid. I came across something called micro inequities training by a guy called Steve Young, who was former head of diversity at JP Morgan. And micro inequities is getting at the often completely unintentional discrimination that individuals enact on each other. Things like going out for lunch with some employees more than others, shaking some employees by the hand when you meet them but giving somebody else a pat on the back, which sends a message about the guy who's been patted on the back, is one of my team. Tiny, tiny individual actions that go on the whole time. And just as Helen has described it with her case, often the individuals, the last thing they think is that they're being in any way biased or prejudiced or behaving in any way other than sort of respectfully towards their peers. It becomes blindingly apparent how these micro inequities are occurring the whole time. At Reuters, we had the micro inequities training, and it was very powerful. We also used reverse mentoring, where we earmarked particular people that we knew could make a real difference if they got it in terms of understanding the impact of inequitable behaviour within the organisation. And with a great deal of care from an external consultancy called Brooke Graham, we matched particular executives with people who were very different from them, different in all kinds of different ways, and we matched them carefully. So that, say, a very senior sales executive who was a pretty testosterone-filled guy was matched with a black American girl who'd been a secretary. She had moved slightly through the ranks. But for him, it was a real eye-opener to have sessions once a month over 6 months. And he went from being, I really don't know what all the fuss is about, why don't we just get on with making money and selling goods, that's what we're all here from, to I never knew it could be like that. And they became extremely good friends, and both of them absolutely started proselytising about diversity and inclusion, and in particular about the value of this reverse mentoring. Yeah, and because this particular guy was very charismatic, to hear him saying, this really matters, and I want all my team engaged in doing something similar, it was kind of, whoa, if he thinks so, there must be something in it. And the other critical part, I think, is engagement at the top. And I think if you have a chairman and chief executive who are committed to creating an inclusive workforce in the organisation, you can go miles very quickly. If you haven't, it's a real uphill struggle.
And when you say go miles very quickly, I mean, give us a flavour for the Reuters experience in terms of the progress you made.
This probably won't sound like a very good example, but it actually was much more significant than I think it sounds. One of the things that we instigated was that all senior executive roles, any changes in those roles had to have a diverse candidate slate put forward before a decision could be made as to who would occupy those roles. And although that sounds like a very simple and surely it was happening anyway kind of change, in fact, it forced people across the organisation to think differently about who they were going to put into roles. There was no target setting. We didn't go that way, but we said there had to be a provable, diverse, credible candidate list shortlisted for each role. And that did have an effect on the diversity of the people who were filling those roles over time.
What are the practical steps can you take? I mean, the things like flexible working, which is clearly going to be very important in the gender diversity issue.
Flexible working and flexible thinking, I think, because I sit on our talent review panel for all the senior appointments here, and it'd be amazing the number of jobs that come up at senior level that have to be done full time in the office. Absolutely have to be. And when you probe, actually they don't. So we've done one recently where the best candidate for this supposedly full-time senior position was for a woman. Well, it has to be done full-time, and I think when you push back you can actually say, well, you can do that role part-time as long as she has support. And that's a great development opportunity for the person who's supporting her, because the days she's not there, they're going to have to step up. Okay, she can supervise. You know, it's win-win. Great for her, great development opportunity. Think slightly differently, structure the job slightly differently. That's what was done. It's working as a huge success, and that's one example.
And I think, it's an inclusion issue, because when I was at Reuters, we had quite an issue in my own team where we had a lot of women working, a lot of them working part-time, but also there were a fair proportion of men as well. And one of the issues that I wanted to deal with was the sort of undertones about, yes, there's flexible working, that's positively promoted within this department, but that means that there are different amounts of time being spent on jobs, apparently different amounts of effort, which may or may not have been the case. And one of the things that we wanted to address was to get those undercurrents out into the open and address as a team what we felt about flexible working, part-time working, sabbaticals and so forth. How were we ensuring that there was fairness not only for those people who were working flexibly, but for those that weren't? And that generated some very interesting discussions and came up with some very real action points. If you're not in the office all the time, can somebody else pick up your file and work with it? This is in the context of a legal transaction. Or can they not find your file? So one of the things we didn't have was a uniform filing system. It tended to be everybody had their own files in their own room or on their own laptops. So we changed that piece of infrastructure to make sure that anybody could access anybody else's work at any time. So it's small issues, but I think it's important to engage everybody in the debate. Otherwise, people can feel, well, I'm being disadvantaged because I'm not one of these special people that's been singled out for flexible working or to be sponsored because I'm a diverse candidate or whatever. So I think that openness and discussion about the issues, which can be very real, is very important.
And I think it's also important to note that flexible working is always thought, oh, it's great for women. Now, I brought flexible working into my team before we brought it in generally at National Grid, and the first 3 people who asked to do it were all men. One because he was a single dad, and the other 2 had really long journeys. And, you know, we set up some basic rules like, you know, I have to have a professional member of staff in the office every day. You can't all work at home on a Friday. But yes, I will set you up with broadband. We will make sure you've got printers. You know, we will make sure you've got mobile phones. So we made it a very positive thing for people, but also a responsible thing. I mean, people had to be responsible about it, and I think you have to trust people also with the flexible working. You can't sort of assume because somebody's not there, they're not doing things. But it's also, I think, the key thing is some people, and I had this particular problem with my team in America, they felt that that's great, we love the flexible working, but that's our career prospects gone. If we work flexibly, we won't get promoted. My UK General Counsel, who has a young baby who was appointed in September, she works flexibly. Great, she's come up through the ranks. She has to leave at 4:30 every day for childcare arrangements, and it's great, it's not seen as a negative.
Just going back as well, saying you mentioned Rosemary, the way business has historically been structured is very much around full-time work, and actually it's about re-engineering business to allow it to be more flexible and therefore a much more inclusive, innovative place to work.
And it's focusing on output, not input.
Exactly.
And that, I think, that focus on output, that was certainly sort of an alleluia moment for us in our thinking at Reuters about diversity and inclusion. It creates a real challenge, I think, for HR departments who are planning and implementing performance review systems. And to focus on outputs tends not to be how people think when they're assessing how their colleagues are working. And I think getting away from the how much do I see this person around the place, as opposed to what has this person actually achieved over the last 6 months or whatever the period may be, is quite a difficult mindset and change, and you need different evidence as well. And I think there is a real role for individuals as well to take the initiative and to be upfront about what they have achieved. And I think perhaps women, and I think it's also sometimes black and other minority groups, are maybe not as good as they could be at blowing their own trumpets. And I think that you can engender change as an individual by promoting what you do more effectively.
And I think that very much chimes with something we see at Hedley Bay when we're interviewing candidates. But often the difference at the most senior ends is your ability to build a profile for yourself within an organisation. And often with very talented women, that's the bit they don't do, even though their work is infinitely superior, often to their male colleagues. And I suppose that raises the question of executive coaching and to what extent that can be beneficial in promoting diversity and inclusion within organisations.
I think coaching can. I think mentoring can be very effective as well. And I suppose by the difference that I see is that with mentoring is that you can both understand, or you'll both know the culture and mores within the organisation, so you can help each other work out how to navigate through that most effectively. I think coaching is slightly different because I think it's very often more objective and more external to the organisation. I think it can be incredibly helpful, and I do think many will think that coaching is a tool to help them get there, and I would agree with that.
Yes, I would. I think you need a mixture of all three. You need the sponsorship so that the people are known, high potential people who are coming through the organisation are known at senior levels. You need the mentoring of people who've been there before. And I think the coaching, what's coaching about? Well, it's trying to get the best out of everybody and get people to reach their full potential. And as you know, Nick, because I bore everybody with this, but I'm training to be an accredited coach because I really do believe that, one-to-one coaching in the right way can be enormously helpful for people.
I don't think one can have a debate about diversity and inclusion without looking at some of the legislative moves that have gone on in the continent. And I guess the obvious one is Norway, where now it is law that 40% of boards have to be female. We've got Sweden potentially following suit. I think Spain by 2015 will be a 40% quota. And the French at the moment have a piece of legislation going through which in 2015 will see 50% of boards female. Should we have legislation in this country?
You asked the question about, is it all about incremental change, or can you make a big leap? And I think the Norway example is absolutely fascinating, that they've managed to do it. I think it was in 1992 they had 3% of the public listed companies were women board members. 16 years later, it's 40%, done by legislation. Between 1992, over that next decade until 2002, they had managed to increase the women on boards by another 3%. So it was up to 6. It took 10 years to get to a 3% increase without legislation, and then a further 6 years to get to 40%. I mean, it just speaks masses. I have to say, I think sometimes you do need draconian legislation to have an effect, and I think the Norwegian example is an example of that, and I do welcome it.
Yes, I'm not quite there yet. I must admit, when I first heard about Norway, I thought that's just wrong. The quality is going to be sacrificed for the statistics. It can't be right. But I'm coming to the conclusion that you are not going to. We would not get the dramatic change here unless we do something dramatic to assist that, because I think it's appeared over the last few years. You look at the number of statistics of women directors in the FTSE 100 and 250. It's not changing very much, is it? And you know, you'll find that boards will have, oh yes, we must have one woman, and we've got one woman, that's fine. And you know, all the evidence shows unless you get 2, 3, 4 women on a board, the company's culture doesn't really change. So how are you going to get that step change without legislation? I don't know.
I think things like the Equality Bill, which is going through in the UK at the moment, may help. I thought it was a rather nice comment was made about in connection with the French legislation that's going through, where one very senior French woman executive said she felt she had changed her position from not wanting this kind of legislation to deciding perhaps it was necessary. But she said, you know, frankly, it's rather humiliating that we have to have it. And I thought that was a good word to describe it. I think there are risks with it. I think the last thing women and minority groups want are to be tokens anywhere. And yes, I think this kind of legislation creates short-term tokenism on a big scale. But I think that might be a cost that's worth paying for the longer-term social benefit.
Yes, but the key thing is if you have the legislation coming in 6, 8, 10 years or whatever it is, you have to get the number of women ready. So that means it's not just waiting, is it? It's actually saying, well, what do we need to do to develop these women to make sure that they can really contribute to boards, to really make a difference. Yeah. So it starts now. And if you've got that sort of Damocles hanging over you in 6 years, it forces companies to do things, which I think is a good thing. I still just feel like, as you said, Rosemary, couldn't we do it another way? It just doesn't seem quite right to me. Yes.
But it may be the only answer.
Yes, that's right.
Well, listen, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating debate, and it will no doubt continue.
Thank you very much.